than just me doing the welcoming. So before we start, I always like to acknowledge the country in which we gather. Indigenous and First Nations leaders, past, present and emerging. For me, that is Yagara and Turrbal people, but we've got people from all over Australia, so that's hundreds of nations. And I really want to acknowledge the traditions of storytelling that have led to the kind of culture and country that we have today and the way that we're going. This is a webinar about the future of learning, so I'm sure that we'll be drawing on some of those traditions, but I'm really, really excited to be talking to the panelists we have at the moment. I might actually get the panelists to introduce themselves as we go. So Dan, you're on the left. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Cam, and also big thanks to Travis and Nick for jumping on today. Very exciting to be amongst such impressive thought leaders in this space. Dan Fish, Director of Strategy here at Go1, particularly keen interest in the broader education space as well at the moment as we start to explore what a lot of that looks like. So yeah, excited to be here today.
And Travis, could you give us a bit of information about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Travis Smith. I'm the education industry lead for Microsoft Australia. So I spend a lot of time working in education, both higher ed and K-12 at the moment, looking at the ways that technology can support learning for both students and teachers and others in departments of education and large universities. So background in edu, so a real passion for the role of technology in learning.
And Nick?
Hi everyone, my name's Nick Burnett, former school principal over in the UK. The last 16 years been MD of Team Teach Asia Pacific, behaviour support, and more recently sort of got a real passion around, rather than education technology, LearnTech and what that might mean, particularly in the K-12 sector, but interested in all forms of learning.
Amazing. So we do have quite the panel today. And that's because we've seen learner behaviour changing so much, you know, from K-12 to university life. I think there's been a huge change. Even at work every day, the systems we seem to use change all the time. There's a lot of things we can cover today, but I think there's two core takeaways that we really wanted to have out of this is where are all these changes leading to and what does the future of learning look like? But I think, Nick, I'd love to put the first question to you. Education is fragmented, it's just disjointed right now, but is that really a problem? I mean, it's worked for where we're at right now, so is that a problem?
I guess what pops into my head, it depends on who you ask. So in terms of probably the lecturers or the teachers or the school leaders, for most, they would probably say, yes, you know, we don't dramatically need to change things, but I often want to go to what might students think, and certainly, you know, in terms of levels of disengagement are significant, certainly in the K-12 sector, and if that's not an indicator that it's not working for them, and primarily, you know, K-12 should be around, you know, what's going to best prepare the young people for the future, and there's a career path around all of that. Could be an interesting bit we get into at some stage. But for me, it's very much around, are we instilling a love of learning, an understanding of learning? And whilst there are some excellent practices out there, and I won't want to decry and label everyone in this space, it is very, very traditional, and it's a very, very slow moving beast in many ways. And in many ways, you know, COVID-19, which was bound to come in at some stage, has sort of accelerated and shown up for where we're at. And hopefully there's a huge opportunity. So at the moment, yes, it is fragmented, and I think that doesn't make sense for the learner, and that's ultimately what the learning institution should be around, for my understanding.
Do you think that's true across the industry though, Travis? Do you think that we're seeing like different areas here, like K-12, graduate, postgraduate, vocational ed? I know you have quite a bit of experience there at Microsoft with the educational industry as a whole. Yep. Is it fragmented across, or are we just talking about particular segments?
Yeah, I think it is fragmented across. You know, it's interesting. I was just reflecting as Nick was talking then. There's a white paper that's just been released by Michael Fuller and Joanne Quinn and others from the New Pedagogies for Deep Learning team and Microsoft. And one of the things they talked about there was the idea that, you know, if there's going to be an education revolution occurs, there's sort of two things that need to be obvious. One is that the current existing education system is kind of not working, to some of Nick's points. And the second thing, which is what, you know, the lockdowns and COVID and remote learning have taught us, is that there is a viable alternative. Now, the challenge that we see, so from a technology standpoint, is that no strategy can quickly become your strategy when you're trying to deliver this kind of learning en masse. And so, you know, we had a Vice Chancellor roundtable with Brad Smith, who's one of our you know, second in charge of Microsoft sort of globally. And he was talking with them, and one of the Vice Chancellors said, you know, one of the things we did was we wanted to enable our teachers to start getting things online really quickly, as everyone did, and they did a wonderful job. All universities and schools have done a power of work in the last few months, as you could understand. But one of the things they did was they just turned on every platform. And so while the teachers were happy with every platform being on because they could fit into their little niche of what they knew, the student experience was terrible. And so this fragmentation of experience from a learner's perspective, not only were they trying to grapple with the knowledge they were trying to learn, the concepts they were trying to learn, but they're also grappling with how do I learn in the context of this class versus that class versus that class throughout even a single day. So I think we've got a ways to go of how we can, you know, how we can integrate learning together for students, but also integrate for teachers and lecturers as well. You know, how do we embed that learning into their day? How do we embed it into the systems that they're using? So I think we are still away from having a perfectly sort of unfragmented experience for lots of people in the sectors.
Who's leading that change then, though? We're talking about technology driving a lot of change here, but is it the learner? Is it external? A kind of question to the panel as a whole to kick us off. Where is the change coming from that's caused this to happen?
I mean, I think there's been I mean, look, I sort of go back and I always tend to cite good old Sir Ken Robinson, but I'm a big fan of his and do appreciate his perspective on some of this stuff. And I think the reality is we sort of still abide by this concept of a sort of this industrial revolution based almost type of education where we're looking at one size fits all approach where we've needed to, you know, back in the day, train people up in certain skills to operate certain machinery, and it doesn't really seem like we've moved away too far from that concept. We still have a group of children, 26, 30 kids in a class, all in a row, facing the teacher, facing back at them, sort of mass training and skilling up. But I think the big thing from my side is that the tech, and I agree with Nick and Travis. I think the thing that we're experiencing at the moment, which is probably not helping with the fragmentation as we see it right now, is that technology piece. And so I think, you know, what we need to do is look at how we not just empower the educators themselves and the institutions, but then also provide this sort of contextualized and personalized experience when it comes to the students as well. So I think, you know, to Nick's point earlier, it would be remiss of us not to mention the current pandemic and COVID-19 that we find ourselves in. But I think, and certainly with my daughter, who's a public high school here in New South Wales, and they're a big user of Microsoft and certainly Microsoft Teams while they were remote learning, it definitely kind of exposed for me how the kind of implementation that needs to happen. So I think when we think about it, and when I think about it from a Go One perspective, it's about trying to have this not ubiquitous necessarily, but agnostic approach when it comes to some of that technology. And I think Travis is absolutely on the money. One of the things that's difficult is everyone has their own platform that they like to use. Everyone has their own style that they're familiar with, and they'll tend to gravitate towards that. And I think that's okay to a degree, but I think underpinning, and again, what we need to be able to go back to is a sort of contextualized and personalized experience for the students. So I know that Microsoft are doing quite a bit of work at the moment around sort of digital identity, and it's something that we at Go One are really interested in from a learner profile or a digital learning ID perspective. This concept of being able to take that learning and, you know, not just from K to 12, not just through tertiary, not just through higher ed, but on into the future, and really create this lifelong learning pathway. And I think part of the point that we see at the moment is that those organizations or institutions or even businesses that tend to see it fragmented in that way, it's very difficult to break out. I mean, what we want to see is actually the K to 12 experience and the tertiary and higher ed to be the beginning of that journey. I think part of the issue right now is this mindset piece that, oh, well, once I've done university, you know, my education's finished and that's me done. Whereas actually the reality is that's just the beginning. So we're starting to see more and more of these providers and, you know, institutions be able to sort of pick up some of that slack. But yeah, there is some ways to go.
I've actually just had a question come in that's really, really relevant to that, and I'd love to put it, especially to you, Nick and Travis, is the fragmentation between K-12 and uni and the professional and corporate education important, and because they're different kind of learning parts of life, or should they be more aligned? And if they should be more aligned, the follow-up is how?
I'm happy to start with that, Travis. I guess it comes back to me about learner agency, which needs to and has to start in, as early as possible, because the risk is people become institutionalized going through school. They become passive in the learning experience, and they're told what to learn, when to learn, and how to learn it. And that flows on into their corporate career if they're not careful. They're just waiting for it to come along and being told what to do, as opposed to saying, this is what I think I need right here, right now. And it goes back to that leading. At the moment, we're largely reactive around all of that. And that's because I guess people haven't had the experience largely of taking control. So the whole piece around developing learner agencies is a crucial one for me. And just very briefly on the technology, for me, and I'm a lover of technology, is how's it adding value to the learning rather than it becoming there's any single answer out there, and it should be seamless in terms of, as I want to augment my learning, what's the best technology approach that's going to help me really supercharge my learning.
And to add to that, Nick, I think inherently K-12 and university learning are different, and there's reasons that they're different. Choose your own adventure learning for young kids is going to allow and push them down a path of not learning some things they actually do need to learn. So there has to be a bit more hand-holding in learning when they're younger, because they don't have the sort of prefrontal cortex developed enough to understand what they should be learning. So there's got to be a little bit of a difference between them. But I agree with what Nick's talking about with that agency part, because we do see that kids at K-12 do learn how to play school, and certainly in my 12 years of teaching, they just go from one class to the next, wandering through the doors and going, well, tell me, Mr. Smith, what we should be doing next, because I've my brain's turned off. And so I think there's a bit of a transition that happens, and we know that, there's stats to show that a lot of kids who kind of have been mollycoddled through high school struggle when they get to university, and suddenly they're in a lecture of 400 other students, and they're an anonymous face in there, and their teacher isn't tapping them on the shoulder going, hey, you need to make sure you've done this so you can do that. And so we know that there's a bit of a change in terms of the type of learning. But I think, one of the other struggles I think we might have is if you push the style of learning and the type of learning further down into high school from that tertiary sector, then everything becomes geared to what we already see it within K-12. When we were looking at curriculum mapping and those sorts of things, the Year 12 teachers in high school would always be saying, well, they should know this by year 9, and by year 8 they should be, and so everything just became a pathway towards sitting a Year 12 exam, and so that's, I don't know whether we really want that either. So yeah, I think there are some differences, but I'm not sure we really want to take all those differences away, I suppose is what I'm saying.
I don't disagree with that. I think, just to add to that, I think there's a couple of pieces there that are really critical for me. And I totally agree with Travis around the foundational learning components that's necessary. I guess for me, what I'm hoping to see more as we sort of transition from high school into that tertiary experience is some empowerment and awareness, the ability to see what it is that I've been doing, where are my strengths. And that's not to say that it necessarily dictates the next step, but at least then they can make an informed decision about what that step looks like. If it's out into the workforce, I've learned all of these skills, and here's the hot spot, but actually I want to do a job that requires these skills that I don't have. So I'm going to make sure that next step is a really informed one, whether it is some, just to go out and work and learn on the job, whether it's to go and, go to TAFE, whether it's to uni. I think that's the critical path for me. And I've been sort of following quite closely the work that Peter Shergold from Western Sydney University has been doing around the learner profile piece. And it's still fairly early days there, but there's some quite provocative questions being asked there around learner pathways or learner profiles versus ATAR scores. And I'm really interested in that, because I think, again, for me, it's about trying to break out of this confine of education finishing after uni and really set up this perspective of a lifelong experience in regards to empowering and enabling that learner to carry on and just see that, you know, when they graduate high school, it's literally the first major life decision they've got. And then beyond that, it's, you know, hopefully you've got 3x more time of learning to do beyond finishing university anyway. I think the other thing, just very briefly as well, that I wanted to touch on, just back to the question, is that, and there's a bit of a hypothesis that we have here, and is around with that transition, not just from sort of K to 12 to college or higher ed, but also then beyond that into the workforce. And actually the question, and maybe we'll touch on it later, is around what role does business have in the provision of education? And even just recently, we've seen with the announcements that Microsoft have put out around sort of learner pathways and pathways critical to career. I was just reading recently about Google's certificate program, which basically is anywhere from 3 to 6 months. You know, they as a business will look at that over a 4-year degree that a lot of people are doing, yes, for specific types of jobs, but you start to see a more informed position played by business that can actually, I believe, help universities and other institutions to respond in a bit more of an agile way. You know, these are the types of organizations that aren't hamstrung with curriculum and other components that probably make it difficult in the defense of some of these institutions to react really quickly. So I think there's a piece there as well.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that last bit there, Dan. You know, an example of this is we ran something called the AI for Good Schools Challenge, which is kind of an introduction to artificial intelligence for students, not students who want to go down the coding pathway, because we think there's enough of that. The reality is that, you know, if we want to solve real world problems with artificial intelligence, then we need the kind of thinkers who aren't in IT class necessarily to be the ones who are involved. And so we want lots of girls, and we want lots of, you know, humanities sort of kids to be involved in this as an idea that they could have a future in this career. One of the challenges is, of course, around curriculum design and getting approvals and whatever, is it just takes so long. And with the speed at which technologies like Microsoft, Google, AWS, and all the others are creating, there's no possible way that they can get a relevant curriculum that is accurate as fast as we could. And so we sort of took the lead on it and sort of said, look, we need to create some kind of curriculum that we can put out there as an offering, you know, for free to schools and to departments of education, to say, hey, you know, this is something that's relevant at the moment. The selfish reason we did it, to be honest, is because we realize that we're going to have a problem filling jobs. We know that the future of something like AI is massive, and we're seeing exponential growth in that area. And we also know that there aren't that many students coming out of schools and universities with the right sort of skill sets. So I think the role of industry in that is going to become increasing over the next 5-10 years for sure.
I would like to touch on that industry in particular, because we've had a couple of questions come through about the workplace. And in that funnel, I guess now when we're looking at these changes, how is that going to impact the workplace in particular? If we're looking at, in the State of Learning report, we had more modular learning, shorter learning on different devices. Mobile is very important now, but how that interacts then with deeper learning. What do you see as the future of learning at work with these changes, and where is it being led from?
I'm happy to jump in on that. I think, again, sort of mentioned the words earlier, and I've talked about this a couple of times, but I think there's a few key topics with this one, and I do believe technology plays a big part in this, in that there is a lot out there. I mean, you just need to look at the volume of learning management systems, LXPs, HR management systems that can all deliver training. I think there is an element of agnostic, well, certainly from a Go1 perspective, we've taken a relatively agnostic approach in that we're very much about content, and we just want to make sure that we're surfacing the right content at the right time and in flow. And I think one of the critical components to that will be the ability to have a decent view of the learner and what they're interested in, and beyond just the performance summary stuff. So one of the provocative questions that we've sort of posed before is, rather than taking that tenure approach to the individual employee's training, which might be anywhere, you know, at the moment, I think the average tenure is 3.5 years, is to take a much more lifelong view of that employee's training. And I think for some people that's caused a little bit of friction, because their view is, well, you know, that's that classic, what if we train them up and they leave sort of, and what if you don't and they stay type scenario. But I think there's a big piece in it now where just looking at that period. And yes, there is some performance related stuff that does need to happen. If you've got a salesperson that isn't firing and, you know, isn't hitting numbers, then obviously there's some things that you need to look at putting in there that will potentially help lift up the quality. But I think there is a bigger piece, which I actually think ends up helping address some of the broader organizational gaps that appear when we take this broader view on the individual employee's journey. And I think nowadays, you know, a number of years ago, that might have been difficult, but I think there is the technology, there are the partners out there that are able to not just surface this quite ubiquitous experience, but also help to identify what it is that these people are interested in. And again, I sort of keep talking about the learner profile today, but for us, it's a really interesting one because, you know, it does give you that ability to personalize and contextualize that journey, and at the same time get far better engagement across the board. So that's just one area.
There's a piece for me in about recognition of what is learning. Traditionally, and this starts in schools, unfortunately, it's very, very narrow in terms of what is, you know, what is articulated as learning. And for me, there's got to be a much, much broader view of what counts as learning, what helps us grow and develop. And it links to, as Dan was talking about, the learner profile. So as opposed to just formally sitting an assessment or an exam or anything else, I'm not saying they're not needed at certain times in certain roles, absolutely, but the more broader incidental learning that's hard to capture, but is so crucial. You know, that reading of that blog post, that listening to that podcast, and just building in the whole self-reflection piece. So what does that do? And making it simple, because we tend to make things far too complicated in education, but make it simple. So what have I learned? What am I going to do differently as a consequence of listening to this webinar? What learner behavior, what has it triggered in terms of my behavior that might be slightly different? And those sort of nudging type behaviors, as opposed to a massive assessment at the end of, you know, a year or 2 years or whatever else, a piece of work that becomes crammed and then largely forgotten afterwards because I cram it to pass that, and it has minimal impact in the longer term.
And I think, you know, I was just jotting down there as you were speaking about some of the ways that sort of we do internal learning at Microsoft, for example. And it is everything from really ad hoc learning, but being encouraged to have a mentor and being encouraged to shadow people and to be thinking about what your future pathway of, you know, what other roles within Microsoft, for example, would be interesting to you, and then what do you need to do to sort of get there? And so if you've got a particular role in mind, it's like, well, who have you spoken to who's in that role? Do you really understand what it is? Have you been out to some meetings with them to understand how they operate, what they do, what are they measured by? So there's all of that sort of learning. Then there's, you know, more sort of, you know, MOOC-based learning and stuff that we do. You know, I'm doing a coaching course at the moment, which is sort of online delivery, but then we have a coach-coachee relationship with someone else within the business who's doing that. There's face-to-face learning, of course, we have that a lot, and especially around some compliance things. You know, making sure that we're sort of really compliant in terms of all of the business laws and all those sorts of things. Then there's we have technical sort of skills initiative, which is kind of more formal learning with a certification at the end around some of our technologies that that also people out there in the world are taking as well. And then there's another element of this, which is really more about the playfulness and the learning that occurs in there. And so at our Redmond campus in Seattle, which is the sort of headquarters of Microsoft, there's literally a massive building called the Garage, and it's basically a hacking space. It's like a STEM space for those of you who are in K-12 or higher ed. It's you walk in there and there's just everything you could possibly want to make whatever you want. And so not only do they run sort of hackathons within a couple of weeks where groups of people get together to solve a problem, and an example of one of the things that came out of that was a tool called Immersive Reader to help students with dyslexia to actually read better. And it allows it, you know, sort of takes all the menus away and puts black background with white writing, and it can read it out aloud, and you can put, you know, dots between syllables and all that sort of stuff that helps those emerging readers. Came out of a person sort of saying in those hackathon days, you know, I've got a nephew who struggles with reading, he's dyslexic, how can our technology sort of support? And so a huge amount of learning occurs in this culture of hacking, of making stuff. And some people go in there just during work hours and take an hour of the, you know, their time out of the day to go in there and build their volcano that's going to flow lava. You know, it doesn't have to be something that's going to lead to a business outcome. It's just sort of building that culture of learning and meeting new people and being agile in your thinking you know, all that sort of stuff's really important within our organization. So there's a whole range of different, you know, to Nick's point before, that narrow view of what learning is, which is just sort of the certification piece. There's this whole range of the way that we learn with our organization, which covers different modalities, but also different levels of content. And yeah, it's a pretty interesting approach.
That's where it talks to the ability, and probably where we are maybe still a little bit behind, is to be able to collate all of this, because I absolutely agree. I mean, if we actually were to look at it on a pathway perspective, the percentage of time we spend in the more formal space of learning is actually very small in relative to the informal stuff. And I think there's even probably a big swathe of people that are learning that aren't aware of it. So we kind of see it, and certainly from an organisational perspective at Go On, we kind of see our job as to really be able to capture that data, the signals, and resurface this information back to the learner to help nurture this concept of a sort of lifelong journey. And I think part of the key component is that they're not mutually exclusive, and they all absolutely should feed into the other. I mean, you know, you might spend 12 months reading about AI or ML, whether it's podcasts, short courses, etc., and eventually get surfaced some form of accredited or short course or whatever it looks like. But what in order for us to truly sort of provide that personalized journey, there's a lot of data that we need to be able to capture. And again, the big question for us is, how are you going to do that when there's a lot of different technologies that are consuming that data? So it's, you know, when we think about it from an organizational learning and development perspective, yes, it is part to do with the tech stack that we've got, but it's also, what are we using to underpin that tech stack that is actually starting to absorb some of this data and enables us to manipulate that to actually look at it, even by employee, what should we be looking at and how can we train them up?
A key aspect I really want to draw out as well is, because this is all about, quite rightly so, learner behaviour, but I guess the mechanisms around the learner. So from a school perspective, the teacher and the principals and whatever else, and in an organisational perspective, the leader or the manager. Because for me, is the big shift is, I think learners, particularly younger learners, will adapt to this very, very quickly. They're sort of waiting for the opportunity to go into this space. But if we don't help change mindsets or help change approaches for teachers and leaders, then they're going to still be locked in that old paradigm of how they were successful. And, you know, I always say teachers are successful in a very outdated system, but it's quite hard then to change to a system where they're actually not the expert. We're not seen as the person with all the knowledge. So I think there's another whole piece around learning or unlearning, as I would talk about, for teachers and leaders, not only in K-12, but universities and wider organizations as well.
I'll move on a little bit just so we can keep going with the time that we've got, but that's a really important point. While I do that, Leanne, you've had your hand up for a little while. I'll let you just ask a question through. You're just on mute for a second there. All right, I'll come back to you, Leanne, just so we can keep things moving. So the big thing that we wanted to touch on today is, what are the major barriers to better learning at the moment, particularly online? I've had a few questions come through about, you know, do we need to track everything? Can't we agree that everyone needs to learn? Or how do you find the right learning at the right time? What is the difference between AI recommendations? So I guess for you, and Nick, I'll let you flow on from what you've just been talking about there. What are the big barriers you see to better learning at the right place at the right time?
Yeah, look, say one of that is the key component I just spoke about, that those who are supporting the learning and how we help encourage them to change their methods and approaches. And there is, there's a high proportion of people in Australia who have access to this technology, but there's a significant number, not only in Australia, but certainly globally. You know, half the world's population don't have access to the internet, and we can sometimes get lost in our own little bubbles and talk about this. So there's a really big piece for me around the digital divide, you know, in terms of the push to online learning that we all had to experience, certainly in the K-12 sector. Some would have really benefited from that because they had that availability and access. Some would have lost out totally. And, you know, it sort of drives a wider divide. So there's a big piece that we're not going to solve now, here and now, but around how do we sort of use technology, because there is huge opportunities there to really give closed that gap that is happening in learning, but also the digital piece.
If I can just build on that and get a little bit futury for a minute, which is actually not that far forward, to be honest. The advent of artificial intelligence and machine learning systems to understand where a learner is, what they need to learn next, to be able to ingest things like educational theory, like the zone of proximal development. We're not far away from systems which will understand where every individual learner is and make meaningful interventions for 25 kids, 500 kids in a university lecture without the teacher having to do it. The challenge is, and this might be a little controversial, but as a teacher and an assistant principal myself back in the day, personalizing learning for 25 kids is near impossible, to be honest. Like, it's okay, in a primary school setting, you've got those 25 kids all the time, but I taught 125 kids. And so therefore, the speed at which I could do assessments, shift my curriculum, now create 5 different levels of that curriculum, it's pretty hard going. And that's why the gravitational pull back to, delivering to the middle is so strong. We do know, though, that with the advent of AI and machine learning, we will probably see some systems which are smarter at doing that more efficiently with more, save teachers time, by being able to use that data and to serve up relevant content at relevant times to students, and the teacher can sort of monitor that from a distance and understand where the students are at, rather than have to drive every experience for every kid at every level. And so we've seen some pretty interesting stuff out of Dr. David Kellerman, for example, at University of New South Wales, who managed to use Teams as a platform, and used a bot in there that sort of captured student questions and allowed the tutor who answered that question in the chat feed to trigger it as a question and answer pair. Then they had, the bot was able to, within 2 weeks, had 200 question and answer pairs around first year engineering. Then it was able to start giving the students answers to questions without a tutor's involvement, that said, hey, go and look here for this, or here's the lecture, here's the point in the video where we spoke about this in lecture 3, minute 8, go and watch from there. There's all of these kinds of things. And then eventually, using machine learning, they were able to, by using a previous year's a cohort's data, predict with about 90% accuracy students' exam results before they would have sat it. So they've applied that to the next batch of students, and were able to create individual study packs for 500 students that were sort of surfaced up as PDFs inside Teams. And that was 2 weeks before the exam. And the result of that was that the exam pass rate went from 65 to 85%. And so I know not all learning is about exams, I get it, but it's an example of the ways that we're starting to see systems help teachers to like have a massive brain and massive amounts of time. And that's something that's a real challenge. The time, everyone could personalize for a class of 3 students, but no one has a class of 3 students. And so the challenge is, how do we use the technology to do it?
I think that's a great one. And Dan, I'd love to touch on, we see like an L&D professional at work with 1,500 people they're looking after, up to sometimes it's a team of 3 for that. Sometimes it might just be a team of 1. How does that then apply to the workplace when we're looking at, again, the same problem, lots of learners, and one, I guess you call teacher or guiding point in this, with lots of managers to help them out. But how does this then change the future here?
I think there's some similarities across the different types of learning and training and education, right? I think, to Travis's point, the big thing here is how we're capturing this data, manipulating that data and surfacing it back. Now, when we think about sort of personalized learning, I sort of always think back to the Khan Academy TED Talk, which is obviously very famous now, and the Los Altos pilot that they did with a number of different high schools around maths there. And, they sort of were watching this trajectory line and watching the kids peel off as they got stuck in certain areas, and the teachers were able to respond. But to Travis's point, it's very difficult to do. And then even if you're thinking about organizational L&D, trying to do that across 15,000, 50,000, 100,000 different people can be tricky. I think the big thing is to start looking at what you have and not to get too overwhelmed. I think there's also a big piece here from an organizational L&D perspective, which is around mindset, trying to be able to capture and focus in on and actually empower the employee. I think more often than not, and I think part of this has also been technologically driven, where the flexibility hasn't been provided, whether it's been around the content, and historically organizations might only have access to 3 or 4 or 5 different vendors. it's always fallen flat, but now we're beyond that. You know, I think about, for example, the work that we have done around the Microsoft Teams integration, being able to service all of the content that we have right in the flow of an employee's discussion with other employees and their manager and whoever else. Like the big thing for me is really to start taking a step back and figure out how you want to do this long term. And I think I've talked about it already, but actually starting to look at that stack, understand what data you are capturing and how you intend on manipulating that. Because to Travis's point, like the future isn't that far away, and there's actually ways that we can already look at the data that we've got and the insight that we can capture, whether it's performance reviews, there's a ton of information out there, and just making sure that we've got the right technology in place to at the very least start to manipulate that and come up with some meaningful solutions from a training perspective. So I think that more so than ever now, when I started on this journey, there was a big component of L&D and organizational L&D getting put into the too hard basket, under-resourcing of L&D teams. You know, it was really difficult. But I think now there's more out there that enables and empowers those individuals within the organization, as well as the management of teams, as well as the individuals themselves. And I think the key thing where organizations want to get themselves to is that learner has the data, has the information, can see what it is that they need to do, where they need to go. And it's more of a conversational piece than with their managers and the organization. I think there's a number of businesses that probably aren't there yet. And for some that might feel overwhelming, but I think there's actually some really clear, simple steps that you can start to put in place to be able to build on. So
I think that's a great one. I'd love to throw to you, Nick, a little bit is if we've got people that are stuck in the trenches every day, that feel like this is something that advanced L&D people are doing all the time, that it might not really be for them. Do you see, is there a maturity gap to this, or do you see some accessibility there at the moment?
I think it's both of those, unfortunately. And look at that, they're working so incredibly hard. That's the problem, is that they are so overloaded, really. With, I always say in education, no one ever tells you to stop doing something. They just add more and more to it. And that's part of the problem, is that people are so sort of time poor, and this has sort of accelerated it in some ways, that it takes brave leaders to say, we're not going to actually do some of this. We're going to actually, cut down on some of those bits. So absolutely, there's just a time challenge around all of that, but there is also an understanding of the opportunities, as Travis was talking about. There are huge opportunities where technology can really help you, teach better and do some of that seriously heavy lifting. But unfortunately, in education, there's been, lots of stops and starts about technology, and I always say it generally goes, and it should be seamless. So when there's an opportunity to use technology to learn, it should just come in and we should be able to use it seamlessly. And I'm sure it's getting a lot better, but historically what happened is they go, right, let's get the technology out. Then you've got to find usernames, passwords, and it sort of gets in the way of the learning, as opposed to just being a nice sort of flow into there. And I know things have improved, but teachers are generally, a conservative group of people with a small c, and slow, and they've had bad experiences in the past. So they need to be helped and to unlearn that actually technology's moved on significantly, and it can really do some of that heavy lifting for you.
Yeah, and I think building on that a little bit, the model around SAMA, which some of you will be familiar with, which is using how you integrate technology into a process, whether you're substituting, just doing the same thing on technology you could have done on pen and paper, augmenting, modifying or redefining at the top level. That's kind of a framework by which you can look at the integration of technology, I suppose. And one of the challenges of that model for me is that people think that substitution's bad. And I think it's a great platform upon which to access the higher levels. You're not going to redefine if you can't substitute. So if anything, the experience we've had in the last 3 or 4 months gets a lot of teachers to a starting point upon which they can do the kinds of stuff that Nick's talking about. And the teachers have been, and my wife is teaching Year 12 mathematics upstairs at the moment. And, the amount of learning that they have done is inspiring. We talk about, from a technology standpoint, Satya Nadella, our CEO, talks about 2 years of digital transformation globally has happened in 2 months. But I think in terms of some educators, they've been brought 10 years ahead of where they were. And there's a real opportunity now for us to sort of work out What we're talking about is hybrid learning, which is the idea of what are the best things that you're able to do in that remote sense that you think we should retain as practice and build it into now the greatness of being face-to-face. Us in Victoria, where I am, we're not back face-to-face at the moment, but we will be at some point. But many other states are. And so this is the time now to grasp the great practice we were doing in that remote learning times, throw out the stuff that didn't work, keep the really good practices that are associated with great learning outcomes, and blend them in, make that hybrid model of having a, technology platform that underpins the experience so that, the John Hattie research talks about homework and its effect size, and it's pretty low, right? It says, but I think that's because of the type of homework I used to set more than anything else. I don't think it's the fact that they did it at home. I think it's that it was like, do questions 7, 8, and 9 if you didn't get to them today. And there are now more profound opportunities. Why can't, given the platforms that we now have in schools, why can't the kids keep writing their drama script tonight at home together? They can, right? We've got the collaboration tools to be able to do that. And so they open up a shared Word doc or a shared Google doc, and they open up a video chat as well, and they can keep working as though they were side to side in the classroom. And it's not about that they can, it's about that they probably should, because the reality is that many of the workplaces that we're shifting to are never going to be the same again as a result of what we're experienced. And one of the things we look at Microsoft when employing people is people's ability to collaborative problem solve over distance using real world tools, because you are on global teams of people solving big problems together where you will never get face to face with each other. And if you do, it's like you're hugging each other for 10 minutes because you know each other so well. And so all of those capabilities and skills are really important to sort of build up in students. And I think this is a beautiful step that we've been forced to take, but it's a launching platform from now on.
I think that's a great time for us to transition away from any of the kind of structured discussion into some rapid fire questions for the last few minutes. We've had so many come through, and I really thank you for engaging so much to the audience today. We'll try to answer as many as we can in the next couple of minutes. Dan, a really quick one for you. What kind of learning is most engaging for the workplace?
I think that is a great and big question. I think, like with a lot of different types of content in the world, there's subjectivity, and I think with learning it's even greater. I mean, auditory music, it's genre based, and that's fairly straightforward. But then when you throw in education and learning, it's not just auditory, it's visual, you read, and then there's different styles that you like. I think, again, the critical piece is to be able to look at, to have the broadest reach. So the great thing with something like a Spotify is that all the genres are there, all the content is there, and you can curate, and then smarts kick in and you get recommendation. And certainly from our perspective at Go One, that has been sort of the mantra, and one of the critical things for us is that we don't want to decide what is always best content, because one man or woman's rubbish is another man or woman's treasure. So it's about sort of empowering the individual to make those choices and to curate that experience to a certain degree themselves. And not everyone's going to like the same content, not everyone likes the same style, and that has been, I think, what has also exacerbated this too hard basket for organizational L&D, is that as an organization, economically and management and vendor, we can only do 6 tops, whereas what we're saying is it's the same across TV, it's the same across books, it's the same across music. Lots of different people like lots of different styles, so giving them the choice is not just great from an empowerment perspective, but also great from an engagement perspective as well.
And Nick, I guess a follow-up for that would be, who do you see as the leaders in shaping this education at the moment? Particularly someone's mentioned researchers in universities seem to be falling behind a little bit in everything we've discussed today. So where do you see the leaders and shapers of education at the moment?
Yeah, look, they're definitely out there in all sectors in my experience, and it's easier to be, I guess, more innovative in certain areas than it is in others, without getting into any political conversations. But there are opportunities out there. But I've seen some fascinating work done, for example, down in Victoria, blockchain in education with primary age kids. A gentleman called Kieran Nolan, where you think, I'm still getting my head around exactly blockchain and that, but he's using it with his primary age kids in a state school. Because largely you can see that, okay, private might have more flexibility and more innovation around all of that. But I think the word that comes to mind for me is courageous leadership and also courageous teaching there. we have to take some risks, and then we have to be in an environment. So big bureaucracies, and I'll finish on this point from my perspective, big bureaucracies they generally want innovation, but they want zero risk. And I get that, particularly around kids. No one wants to put their kids at risk, but you can't have innovation with zero risk. So it's how do we get to a balance, where there is innovation. We understand there's degrees of risk, but we're sort of managing those bits, because that's not preparing young people for the future where they are out there, where we need to take some risk, and it's calculating what those risks are, and where's the benefit and payoff. So I haven't really answered your question, but there are lots of pockets out there. If you look around and search around, LinkedIn, you see some great posts from a range of people doing some fascinating, innovative stuff in all sectors, in my experience.
Yeah, I think just picking up a bit on that last bit you were talking about there, Nick, around the risk bit. It's not that risky to try a new practice at some point in time through a child's K-12 journey, and so as long as you're doing it in some framework of reflection where you work out whether it works or not. And so, professional learning communities, bringing teachers together as a group of 5 to explore a new technique, might be technology or otherwise, ideate what that might look like, go in and try it, observe each other's practice, come back and reflect, and then work out, should you throw it out or are we going to tell others about it? And the time to do that, the research shows, is about a 6 to 8 week period. Mm-hmm. Now, you might only teach your class with that new technique you're experimenting with, that risky technique, for 3 or 4 lessons. I mean, in the context of a student's life, I don't recommend doing that before the Year 12 exam, but in the context of a student's life, it's probably not that risky. And then it's about finding those promising practices and building on those, as which have got a little bit of evidence behind them, both from stuff you read, from existing educational research, but also experience and feedback from students. So I think that we do have to sort of I think you're right, that bureaucracy risk thing is huge, but in a school, you need that culture of those leaders that Nick's talking about, to be able to say, hey, why don't we try some stuff here and do some action-based research around it and see what works for the students, and then work out whether we should share those practices.
It's very much that, what I call practice-based evidence. So there's a big push, quite rightly so, for evidence-based practice, but I always say, to end up with that, someone's got to try it somewhere. So it's encouraging people into that space.
I think that's great too. I've got one last one, because Charles has been waiting since almost the beginning of the webinar to ask this one, and then we'll wrap everything up, which is, what role do you see the corporate world, and in turn enabling technology, playing in reducing the fragmentation between K-12 and tertiary, since we're talking about this and an innovation leading from the schools, but what role do you see the corporate world playing in that in the future workforce?
Yeah, go on, Travis.
Oh yeah. Well, from our perspective, it's kind of, we look at this at the skills sort of journey across all students, right? From little kids working on, building sort of STEM capabilities and thinking differently and problem solving skills and all that sort of stuff, right through to, getting into real world technologies that students in year 10, 11 and 12 IT classes might be using, the thing like the AI for Good challenge, which is across year 7 to 12, but not really IT focused. It's more designed thinking around technology. So it's understanding sort of, and then into university, we have an amazing thing called the Imagine Cup, which is a competition for higher education students and teams to, one of the leading teams, or one of the winning teams a few years ago from education, created a mobile phone app which you could use in any community around the world, a little color swatch that sort of sat on your finger and was testing anemia. And one of the ways you can test that is the color under the pinks under your eyes, and whether or not that's pink or whether it's very pale. And it's a leading cause of childhood death in many sort of developing countries. And so they created this app where you take a photo, and the little color swatch caters for really bad cameras on phones sometimes, and sort of allows it to then get back to the internet, upload it to the cloud, analyze it, and send out medicines. And so, just a simple application of technology made by a group of university students who then got $50,000 to try and make that real, is a way that we're sort of looking at developing skills in higher ed students. And I know it's not just us, right? Google and AWS and Adobe and all of these other companies are investing in programs of trying to help students develop those skills from K to 12 right through to university level. So I think we have a big role to play. And as I sort of said before, we're kind of, it's almost our corporate responsibility to do so, because we're the ones creating part of the challenge around building curriculum fast enough, because the technologies are emerging so fast that we kind of need to get on the front foot and go, we know you're probably not going to be able to get this curriculum up and running before we change it. So here's the curriculum and we'll update it for you.
Yeah, and I think just following on from that, I had a really interesting conversation with a great group of individuals sort of, at PwC the other day, and you know, it was just thinking some of these big, and it doesn't have to be big global businesses, but understanding the areas of IP and expertise that they have. And we were talking about tax at the time, which isn't everyone's cup of tea, I appreciate, but there's a real leadership role that an organisation like that can bring in helping to educate and train up the next sort of swathe of tax experts. And we sort of, Nick's touched on it, Travis touched on it, and I sort of touched on it earlier in the session myself. I think, personally, I think education has business has and corporate space has a massive role to play in the future of education, for the points that Travis was making about its agile nature and ability to respond and react quickly, for the likelihood that it will have that foresight of what's down the path and where the shortcomings will be and where people and the skills will be required. And I'm really excited because to Travis's point, we're seeing organizations like Microsoft, AWS, Google, etc., really sort of starting to take a bit of a leadership position, but it doesn't necessarily need to just be the big tech businesses. It's about some of these businesses and organizations really understanding the role that they play and where they can add value. And I think that's actually really, really exciting for me. And I think one of the things that's going to help bring the more institutional style of education forward somewhat, because even if you look at the Google certificate stuff, they're now saying, well, we'll look at 3 to 6 month certificate versus a 4-year degree, and there's going to be a response required or an engagement required from some of those institutions that would normally do the degrees that would push those roles. So
I think that's we've gone way over time there, so I'll pull up the thank you for watching screen and again say thank you to Travis and Dan and Nick for that. It's something I think that's hammered home for me, is that, you know, the learning just doesn't stop now. You don't do a degree and then that's your life. You don't do your K-12 and then you finish and do a profession, that's all you do. It's just ongoing, it's changing. There's so much interesting and so much engaging things for the future. So once again, thank you to the three of you for joining. Thank you to the attendees for posting so many questions. We'll do our best to answer as much as we can and follow up with some of those articles in an email afterwards, as well as the recording. But is there any last comments that the three of you would like to have before we sign off?
I mean, I'd just like to thank Travis and Nick very much for jumping on. It's always a pleasure to spend time talking with them, and really, really insightful. And I think critical to the conversation at the moment is to actually be looking at the broader education space right now and see how that impacts across K-12, higher ed, organisational learning and development. So I think very lucky to have these two individuals on. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Cameron. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Cam.
Thanks, everyone. We'll catch you next time.